Juneteenth is a holiday that's new to some people and that's old to other people. It began in 1865 on June 19th, when word came to parts of Texas that had not heard. In fact, I think it was Galveston initially. They had not heard that the Civil War was over, that the Confederacy had lost and the Union had won, and that slavery was over, at least the first version of slavery in America. This was the occasion of great rejoicing. In fact, the first Juneteenth was observed in Galveston the following year in 1866 as a recognition of that anniversary. And this year, as you probably saw in the news, it was finally declared to be a federal holiday. And it passed overwhelmingly, over 400 votes in the House of Representatives. Who knows when we'll see another vote like that again. But as some observers have noted, it may be easier to celebrate a one-day end of slavery, all done, than it is to grapple with the complex legacy of racism that persisted after 1865, or the basic contradictions of the high language of our founding documents, like all men are created equal, and a world that allowed and encouraged and supported and defended slavery. They coexisted for quite a long time in this American experiment. You see, those issues of the legacy of racism and the contradictions of our founding documents, those are more complex than they are comforting, but they might also be a little more true to human historical experience. Now, the Jewish people, and Jewish people writ small, talk about slavery every year. They just do it around Passover. And they talk about their own slavery as the Jewish people in the stories in the Torah. In fact, the shortest summary of any Seder you could do is simply to say 5 words in Hebrew. Avadim hayinu ata b'nei chorin. Slaves we were, now we are free. Now, there, of course, is a lot more detail about Egyptian slavery in the Torah itself, in the Passover Haggadah, the narratives of oppression, confronting Pharaoh, and ultimately the exodus to freedom. And we also know archaeologically this is a founding narrative of the Jewish people, but it may not have happened in a historical, real sense. It's a story that's powerful. It's part of our literature and sources, even if it may not have happened in real life. And there are certainly definitely strands in that Jewish tradition that take that founding story of the exodus from Egypt, the end of Egyptian slavery, and they claim to have learned the right lesson from this. Passages that say, do not oppress the strangers because you were strangers in the land of Egypt. Give your servants, even give your animals a day of rest, 1 out of every 7, because you were slaves and I, the Lord, brought you out of Egypt. And many more like that. And it's not only confined to Passover. We also find passages in other parts of the Jewish liturgical year that speak to this need to sympathize with the oppressed and to free those who suffer. Here's an example of a passage from the Yom Kippur liturgy from Isaiah chapter 58. To be sure, they seek me daily, eager to learn my ways, like a nation that does what is right, that has not abandoned the laws of its God. They ask me for the right way. They are eager for the nearness of God. Why, when we fasted, did you not see? When we starved our bodies, did you pay no heed? Why aren't you listening to our sacrifices, they ask, and here is the answer from the prophet. Because on your fast day, you see to your business and oppress all your laborers. Because you fast in strife and contention, you strike with a wicked fist. Your fasting is not the kind to make your voice heard on high. Is this the fast I desire, a day for men to starve their bodies or bow the head like a bulrush? No, this is the fast I desire, to unlock the fetters of wickedness, untie the cords of the yoke, to let the oppressed go free, to break off every yoke, to share your bread with the hungry, to take the wretched poor into your home, when you see the naked to clothe them, and not to ignore your own kin. And then your light will burst through like the dawn, Your healing will spring up quickly. The presence of the Lord will be your rear guard. When you call the Lord, he will answer. If you banish the yoke from your midst, the menacing hand, the evil speech, and offer your compassion to the hungry, satisfy the famished, then your light will shine in darkness, and your gloom shall be like noonday. Well, here we have a thrilling statement of sympathy with the oppressed, of fighting, of breaking the yoke. A human treated like an ox should never be, one might think. And some out there, even today, assume that there is a straight line from those wonderful passages in the Torah and in the founding documents of Jewish tradition to an unequivocal Jewish opposition to any kind of slavery and absolute support for racial justice yesterday, today, in all eras, in all places. They feel that if you combine these threads I mentioned in Jewish sources, and you combine the Jewish historical experience of having suffered as a second-class minority under both Christian Europe and the Islamic Mediterranean and Middle East, and if you add that to more recent experiences of Jewish facing of discrimination and hatred in the 19th and 20th centuries in Europe and in the Americas, from the mundane of no Jews or dogs allowed signs on clubs and universities to direct persecution, violence, expulsion, and even, of course, the Holocaust. Well, if you combine all of these factors together, what else could be the result but an automatic Jewish sympathy for the downtrodden, the oppressed, and an opposition to any form of slavery, particularly America's racialized version? But remember our approach to history: complexity over comfort. Real history is more complicated. It's messy. It's less about ego boosting than finding the truth. If we respond to hearing these stories, well, that history doesn't make me feel good. We need to learn more about how history really works. In some ways, it's like what we've had to learn about how science really works through our pandemic experience. Sometimes we don't know all the answers. Sometimes new evidence changes our opinion. Sometimes what was thought to be safe before is no longer thought to be safe. And what was thought to be dangerous turns out not to be. If you're still putting your mail in the garage for 3 days before you open it, don't bother. That was state-of-the-art wisdom 15 months ago, but not anymore. Well, that's how science works. How history works is the same: to complicate the easy assumptions, to understand the unheard narratives, to find out what really happened, even if it doesn't make us look good. As I mentioned earlier, this Shabbat we are marking Juneteenth for the first time as a federal holiday. And I want to use this opportunity to look for a clearer understanding of the complex relationship between Jewish life and slavery over those centuries before June 19th of 1865. So here are some complications with that simple story. Complication number one. We think of the Exodus story as a simple from slavery to freedom narrative. Once we were slaves, now we are free, says the song, right? But this was not freedom how we might think of freedom in the 21st century. There was the death penalty for violating the Sabbath, or for cursing with God's name, or for gathering sticks on the Sabbath, or for same-sex attraction. There were dietary laws that could cut you off from the community if you chose to violate them. There were mandatory sacrifices by everyone to the Hebrew God, even those who didn't identify or were not part of the Hebrew people. There was absolute obedience to follow all the laws and the statutes that Yahweh the God had given to the priests in their Torah, without being allowed to turn to the right hand or to the left. The Jews may no longer have been slaves of Pharaoh in that narrative, but they were still serving someone. In fact, at the very end of Leviticus chapter 25, it's made explicit. Remember, the word for slave in Hebrew is avadim, avadim hayinu. We were slaves. But when it comes to talking about God, the translation is often servant instead. But in the Hebrew, it's very clear. And here it is in verse 55. Ki li vnei Yisrael avadim. To me, the children of Israel are avadim. Servants, slaves. Avdaihem, they are mine. They are my servants, my slaves. Asher hotzeti otam mi'eretz Mitzrayim, ani Yahweh Elohechem. Why are they mine? Because I took them out of Egypt. They are no longer slaves to a human, but maybe they're still slaves to me. Certainly from a secular and humanistic perspective, you might well be sympathetic to a vision of this as simply exchange of masters, but not necessarily absolute freedom. We find a second complication in another passage in the Hebrew Bible, in fact, in the book of Exodus, shortly after being taken out of Egypt itself. What we find in Exodus, and repeated again in the book of Deuteronomy in a somewhat shorter form in Deuteronomy chapter 15, is a system that not only accepts slavery, but provides rules and guidelines and permissions to the master to not only own slaves, but to even be cruel to them. And I want to take you through some of the examples here. Here are some of the rules to be set before the children of Israel. This is, by the way, right after the 10 Commandments have been given. When you acquire a Hebrew slave, he shall serve 6 years. In the 7th year, he shall go free without payment. If he came single, he leaves single. If he had a wife, his wife leaves with him. So there is a get out of jail free card, so to speak. In the 7th year, what will be called later the year of the Jubilee, the Hebrew slave is allowed to go free. However, if his master gave him a wife and she has borne him children, the wife and her children shall belong to the master, and he shall leave alone. But if the slave declares, I love my master and my wife and children, I do not wish to go free, his master shall take him before God. He shall be brought to the door or the doorpost. His master shall pierce his ear with an awl, and he will remain his slave for life. So no more 7 years get out free anymore. You're a slave for life because you didn't want to leave your wife and children behind in slavery. It gets better, worse, your opinion. When a man sells his daughter as a slave, she shall not be freed as male slaves are. If she proves to be displeasing to her master, who designated her for himself, he bought her intending for her to be his wife, he must let her be redeemed. He shall not have the right to sell her to outsiders, since he broke faith with her. And if he designated her for his son, he shall deal with her as is the practice of free maidens. If he marries another, he must not withhold from this one her food, her clothing, or her conjugal rights. So she needs to be treated like a real wife, even if she was really a slave wife. And if he fails her in these ways, she goes free without payment. Well, isn't that nice? It even gets worse. The later discussion in this chapter, the parts we're skipping, discuss damages. When people are fighting with each other, when they hit each other, when they quarrel with each other, what happens? And then it raises the question in verse 20. When a man strikes his slave, male or female, and he dies there and then, he must be avenged. But if he survives a day or two, he is not to be avenged, since he is the other's property. And then it talks about damages of physical forms. An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot. Well, what about a slave? Not quite the same. When a man strikes the eye of his slave, male or female, and destroys it, he shall let him go free on account of his eye. If he knocks off the tooth of his slave, male or female, he shall let him go free on account of his tooth. So there are limits on slavery, but there is definitely slavery, and there is definitely violence in slavery, ownership in slavery, even ownership in perpetuity, and of course, the cruel choice of individual freedom or staying with your enslaved family. There was even more slavery countenanced in the Hebrew Bible, because after all, how does one become a slave? One is not necessarily born into it, but what if, given a capitalist-based economy, one gets into debt? And in fact, so much debt that it is almost impossible to get out of it. And you owe your life to someone else in some ways. Well, they explored that possibility again back in Leviticus 25. This possibility of what's called economic servitude was understood. If your kid, this is verse 39 here in Leviticus 25. If your kinsman under you continues in straits and must give himself over to you, Do not subject him to the treatment of a slave, of an eved. And you have at the end of the word, avodat aved, the slavery of a slave. He will be with you like a toshav, like a resident, a bound laborer, someone who you hire. He will serve with you only until the Jubilee year, and then he and his children will be free and go back to his family. After all, the Hebrews are my servants. They are avdai, my servants or slaves. They will not give themselves over to be slaves to others. And you cannot rule over him ruthlessly. Fear your God. However, such male and female slaves as you may have, like real slaves that you could do what you do to slaves, those you acquire them from the surrounding nations. So we have here a distinction between how Jewish servants, slaves, indentured servants are treated, and non-Jews who can be treated like real slaves. You may also buy them from among the children of aliens resident among you, or their families among you, and they shall become your property. You may keep them as a possession for your children after you, for them to inherit as property for all time. Such you may treat as slaves. But as for your Israelite kinsmen, no one shall rule ruthlessly over the other. And in fact, if a resident alien has prospered and your kinsman comes under his authority and becomes a slave to the resident alien, he shall still have the right of redemption. One of his kinsmen can pay him off and redeem him. Well, here we have disparate treatment for the non-Jewish slaves, buying children, passing them down as property. This is what is called chattel slavery, because the slaves are property that can be owned, abused, and bequeathed to one's descendants. They are slaves in perpetuity and from generation to generation. And so for those American slaveholders who looked for justification for the terrible versions of chattel slavery that they were putting into place in the Caribbean, in Latin America, and of course in North America, they had ample precedent in the Bible that they read, in their Old Testament or our Hebrew Bible. They did not have to go very far to find confirmation that what they were doing was part of the divine plan. And that's sad. Yet another complication. These Torah laws were written for a world where Jews could make the rules for themselves and for anyone who lived with them, the resident alien we saw mentioned. Now, much of Jewish history over the last 2,000 years, certainly before the 20th century, has been experiencing life as a non-sovereign, living in diaspora where other people make the big rules. We can rule for our own local community, for our internal affairs, but the big laws of life and death and property are often determined by the powers that be, which were not us, and in a pre-democratic age did not necessarily concern themselves with our opinions. And in many of these societies, in the Greco-Roman world, in parts of Christendom, and certainly parts of the Muslim world, slavery was part of the territory. It was simply accepted as a common practice. In fact, I will share with you, my father's family came from Syria originally. In fact, my grandmother was born in Syria, came over in her tens or so, and Arabic was always her first language. It was the Jewish style of Arabic, but it was basically Arabic. And her word for a Black person, even into the 1990s and early 2000s, until she died, her word in Arabic for a Black person was abd. And abd, you might hear a little bit of that word in Hebrew, eved, servant or slave. That was simply the generic term that she used, referring to someone who was Black. They were abd, they were servants, because even in the Middle East, in later years, that concept of dark skin equals servitude was also part of the landscape. And Jews lived in that landscape. Jews were taken as slaves by other people, certainly after the Roman revolt. In fact, many speculate that the nucleus of the Jewish community in Rome was made up of Jewish slaves taken after the multiple Jewish revolts against Rome and then ultimately freed by their masters. And it was accepted as a normal practice throughout the Middle Ages. There are plenty of passages in the Talmud that describe how to acquire slaves, how to treat slaves. There are rabbinic responsa letters when people have questions of what do I do with this slave and how do I understand them. In fact, there's even one example of a slave who was taken from what is today Ethiopia and they claimed that they themselves were Jewish and should be treated like a Jewish slave and not like a non-Jewish slave. And so then the slave owner writes a letter to his rabbi to ask, what do I do about this? How do I prove whether this person genuinely is Jewish or not? It's part of Maimonides' codes of law written in the 1200s. This is simply part of the landscape. There's even questions of, do I need to circumcise my slaves or not? Should I convert my slaves to Judaism? This was part of the world. And Jews lived in that world and were affected by that culture. We like to imagine Jewish life in a bubble, but that isn't how it really worked. And by the way, the same thing happened with polygamy too. Jews living in Christian lands for the last 1,000+ years have not been allowed to marry more than one wife because that's the surrounding culture's ethos. But Jewish men living in the Muslim world were allowed to marry more than one wife into the modern period because that was also the practice of Islam, accepting up to 4 wives following the model of Muhammad. So, as they say, what happens outside happens inside too. And a fifth complication, and this brings it home to the Americas. What is the nature of Jewishness and whiteness in the racial slavery system that took place in the Americas? And I have to point out, by the way, that this system of racialized slavery that took root in the Americas actually has its roots in Europe, in the English and Dutch and Spanish and Portuguese empires. You can read more about this, by the way, in Ibram Kendi's excellent history book, Stamped from the Beginning, which dives into the European roots of the American style of racialized chattel slavery. Think about the triangle trade, which pre-exists America, of course, going from the Caribbean to North America and back to Africa, bringing molasses and rum and slaves in the famous song from 1776. It was simply part of the empire, was this creation of property from people. Some people would point to a passage in the book of Genesis that describes the cursing of Ham, one of the sons of Noah, and in particular his son Canaan, who saw Noah naked, as a justification for the persecution of the dark-skinned. This is less prominent in Jewish sources than in Christian interpretation of that story. There are a couple examples that might be used in that direction, but it wasn't the dominant Jewish style of interpreting that particular story, but it did become important, certainly, in the European colonial mind. Now, remember, in this period, in the 1700s, maybe even early 1800s, certainly in the 1600s, Jews were not allowed to live in Spanish and Portuguese colonies. They were Catholic-only colonies, and we still had this thing called the Inquisition running around, looking for hidden Jews. So many Jews did not choose to live in Spanish or Portuguese colonies. They left those, particularly when the Inquisition showed up. But in some Dutch and French and even British colonies, Jews were allowed to live. They weren't accepted as full citizens at all times. They couldn't necessarily serve in government or vote. Often to vote or to serve in government, you had to swear an oath as a Christian or swear an oath even on a Protestant Bible. So in some of them, Catholics were not full citizens either. But in general, Jews had some of the basic rights of what would become white people by that definition. They could own property. They had the rights to do business and to trade internationally. They had commercial rights. They participated in the general economic life of these colonies. Now, in 1991, a book came out actually published by the Nation of Islam that claimed that Jews dominated the Atlantic slave trade. But the reality is they did not dominate the transatlantic slave trade or slave ownership for that matter. Jews were a very, very small percentage of the colonial population. Around the time of the Declaration of Independence and the American Revolution, Jews were like 0.1% of the population. There were a few thousand Jews scattered among a few port cities, north and south, among the British colonies. They just were not large enough to dominate anything. And it does come out in some of the statistics. However, they also were not teetotalers and abolitionists who were opposed to any form of slavery at all. Jews participated in proportionate numbers in both slave trading and in slave owning, especially in some of the Caribbean islands. In fact, if you go to Suriname, they have a beautiful synagogue there that's been preserved with a sand floor and beautiful declarations. You'll also notice a lot of the street names are named after Jewish families that were prominent plantation owners there, but they owned slaves. And if you know anything about the slavery experience in the sugar plantations in Suriname and in Curacao, it was the most brutal, awful slavery you could imagine. Amputating limbs, working the slaves to death, not even bothering to feed them or care for them in any way, because they were cheap to just import more. I mean, it really was some of the worst experiences of slavery to be found, and Jews were a part of that society and a part of that experience, both in the Caribbean and also in the American South. As one example, just a few statistics, Jews accounted for 4 out of 44 slave brokers in the city of Charleston, which was a major importation port for for African slaves, rather, by European traders. So they were about, 10% of the slave brokers in Charleston. They were 3 out of 70 in Richmond, more like 5%. They were 1 out of 12 in Memphis. So again, not a dominant proportion by any means, but not insignificant either. However, the proportion of Jewish residents of Charleston, South Carolina, who owned slaves before the Civil War was generally similar to the general population. So about 83% of Jewish residents in Charleston owned slaves. 87% of the general population in Charleston owned slaves. I also found out, by the way, when I led a tour to Charleston a few years ago, that some Black people in Charleston also owned slaves. If they had been freed and were of a certain economic status and could afford it, they themselves sometimes bought slaves too. That was part of the ethos of the area. Now, when it comes to the fighting against slavery in America, the abolitionist movement, there certainly were some abolitionist Jews. Now, abolitionists tended to be white Protestants, and their evangelical Protestant fervor was a part of their motivation for the work they were doing. And so that might have been a break for some Jews in getting involved in the organized movement. But there were some prominent Jews who were prominent abolitionists too. One example was a rabbi named David Einhorn, who had come over from Germany, was a prominent reformer in Jewish life. He wrote one of the first Reformed prayer books in America, which had the prayers in Hebrew and in German rather than English, because that was his native non-Hebrew language, and that of his congregation as well. But he made a lot of changes to the prayer book and was very convinced in the power of Enlightenment ideas, including opposition to slavery. Now, he was originally a rabbi in Baltimore, and it was so controversial what he was saying about slavery in Baltimore, he actually fled town shortly ahead of the lynch mob. He barely got away. He wound up moving up the road to Philadelphia, where he acquired his lifetime pulpit and continued to thunder against slavery as a moral wrong. Now, there was another rabbi at the same time who took the opposite side of that issue. His name was Morris Rafal. He was originally from Sweden, actually, but had taken a pulpit in New York City. And he very publicly had a dispute with Einhorn that slavery was endorsed by the Bible and quoted many of the passages that we just saw earlier tonight. I will also mention one other abolitionist who deserves mention. Her name is Ernestine Rose, who was a public speaker in an era in the 1840s and 50s when women were not expected and even allowed to be public speakers. She was a strong advocate for women's rights. She was a strong critic of religion too, by the way, as a justification for both slavery and women's oppression. And she criticized the Bible in public, which was not necessarily designed to win friends and influence people. But she was a very strong voice for emancipation. And she also was in favor, after the Civil War, of the amendments that gave Black men the right to vote. And some feminists who had been involved in the emancipation movement were opposed to those amendments because they gave Black men the right to vote before white women. And some of the rhetoric they used was particularly obnoxious. Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton said some terrible things in those moments. But Ernestine Rose was consistent. She said, an advance of rights is an advance. And so we'll give Black men the vote and still advocate for women of all colors to get the vote eventually. Jews served on both sides during the American Civil War. About 70% of the Jews who served in the Union, about 30% were in the Confederacy, but that was also the approximate proportion of Jewish population distribution. In fact, if you go to Charleston, South Carolina, even today, there's a Reform synagogue there called Kahal Kadosh B'nai Elohim that has a beautiful building that was built in the 19th century. And they have a wonderful mural there that tells the story of the members of the congregation, including one panel that shows their service to their country in military uniforms. And you see a World War II uniform and a World War I uniform, and you see a gray uniform because they're in Charleston, not in New York City. In the end, as we saw, Jewish tradition did put limits on slavery and also accepted it and managed it well into the 19th century. As much as we like to think that we are different, we're separate from the world around us, have a higher morality, well, Jewish people have always been influenced by the surrounding culture, whether they were opposed to slavery, which of course comes out in the abolitionist era with the general ferment of abolition. There were no Jewish abolitionists in the 1300s when Maimonides is codifying in his law that you can have slaves and treat them a certain way. But there is also this trend of reducing, managing, and having that rhetoric that sometimes comes to bear in different times and different places. We saw in our service how Martin Luther King Jr. quoted those same words, "All men are created equal," that were written by the slaveholder Thomas Jefferson in his Declaration of Independence. It means something different when the descendant of a slave says it than when a slaveholder writes it. Abraham Joshua Heschel, who was a prominent rabbi in the latter part of the 20th century, is often pointed to as an example of this straight line of Torah justice from the end of the Exodus through the marching for civil rights. And there's a famous picture of him in his prayer shawl marching with Martin Luther King Jr. in a march in Selma for civil rights. In 1972, Rabbi Heschel wrote, "Morally speaking, there is no limit to the concern one must feel for the suffering of human beings. Indifference to evil is worse than evil itself, and in a free society, some are guilty, but all are responsible." As I said, very few Jews who were slave traders or slave owners, or proportionally even defenders of the Confederacy. And we should also note that the ancestors of most American Jews today came to North America from Europe or the Middle East well after the first Juneteenth in 1865. The big waves of Eastern European Jews didn't start until the 1880s. However, if we understand slavery not just as the slavery that ended on Juneteenth of 1865 and before, but rather understand slavery as a large stone that falls in the pond of America and creates ripples and waves that continue to spread out and impact the shore. Understand the ripples of that slavery in a society that accepted it for centuries and readapted that bias to Jim Crow and redlining and discrimination for another 100 years and beyond. Maybe we can understand better why we as Jews need to own our own complicated history with that very peculiar institution called slavery. Well, at this point, I'll stop. And I'd like to ask if anyone here has any comments or questions or reactions to that history of the Jewish relationship to slavery and its effects in the United States at the end. Yeah, Peggy and Bill, go ahead.
Regarding Charleston, my son worked there for 6 years, so I went there often. And there's a tremendous Jewish population, but there's also a really anti-Semitic area. They have a couple of clubs there that they don't allow anyone, unless you have a heritage that's over 200 years old, to join. They're a very closed society, and some of the things that they do, they still blame the Jews for spoiling their economy. I took one of the, horse-drawn carriages, and one of the men on the tour that I was on said, why do you people just keep refusing to accept the fact that the Jews didn't spoil your economy? And this bus driver was really, he was irate. He said, if they hadn't come in and they hadn't told us we couldn't have slaves, how could we ever do our own farming? How could we do all those things ourselves? So when you go down there, I still feel that steeped in history that they have not let go of.
Well, again, we have to remember, just as we can't stereotype minorities, we shouldn't stereotype the white people in Charleston either, because I'm sure there are good-minded people too. And this is the complexity of a cosmopolitan city. It's a city of multiple churches and different ethnic groups as a port city that came there. But it also has this long legacy. It was the major importation port for slaves until the slave trade was banned. And it was still an important part of the economy. I mean, you noticed in the numbers I gave you of the number of slave traders, there were 44 slave traders in Charleston, and there were 12 in Memphis. Charleston was still an important hub of the slave trade. And it's, again, to our shame that some Jews were part of that, but they were part of the society. And that's unfortunately how things came about. And bigotry doesn't know a boundary. We might think we're white, but to some people, we're not white enough. Yeah. Emma, you were going to jump in?
Yeah, well, a couple of things. What I was going to say, being a product of your own time and doing things that others do is something that it's hard to justify, but it is part of the scene. So I again, it's very difficult morally to say, well, it's okay to have slaves, the Jews or not, and to have been slave owners or slave traders. But again, the times were such that that's what people did. And then another thing I was going to ask on the practical side for me, you quoted several people and books and so on. So because this is recorded, I'm assuming that those will be made available so that we can look at that.
I'll put a note in the description of the video, so when it comes out, you can look at the description and you'll have the title.
That'd be awesome.
I mean, the number one thing I would suggest, if you want to know the history of racism in America with its European roots, is Ibram Kendi, Kendi, and the book is called Stamped from the Beginning. It's a really good exploration of this in different periods in American history, and in particular focusing on the issue of racism and its origins and development. As an intellectual history, it's really excellent.
If you're interested too, there's a wonderful podcast called Seeing White. It's part of the Scene on Radio, SCENE, series, and it's not very long, but goes into the historical roots of what it means to be white, and where whiteness comes from, and actually connects to a lot of the European history that the rabbi alluded to today.
There's also an amusing book called How Jews Became White Folk that describes our evolution in American society from an excluded minority to eventually being accepted as white enough for certain purposes. And the book can get a little academic, but it's by Karen Brodkin, Brodkin, called How Jews Became White Folk, if you're curious about the particular Jewish angle on that question. Any other comments or questions?
Yeah, I'll go. Yeah. A few months ago, I read the book, The Third Daughter. I don't know if anybody read it, but that talks about how Jews got involved in sex trade and with Europe and Argentina, and apparently that went on until the 1930s. So
yeah, they used to call that white slavery. Today we call it sex slavery, and it was a really nasty business where Jews were very involved in this, often kidnapping or deceiving Jewish women from Eastern Europe, showing up, marrying them, and then on the boat raping them and tearing up the ketubah and forcing them into sexual slavery, particularly in Buenos Aires, also to some extent in South Africa. If you're interested in a really fascinating fictional version of this, there is a book called The Ministry of Special Cases by Nathan Englander, which is set about 50 years after that period, where it's talking to the children and grandchildren of this community, because actually the prostitutes and their pimps had their own synagogue and had their own burial society and had their own part of the cemetery, because there were so many of them and they were all still Jewish. The premise of the book is there's a guy who goes around intentionally defacing the headstones in the prostitute cemetery so that people who came from that community are no longer identified with it. They can sort of erase their own history. So it's a Jewish man whose name is Kaddish, the prayer for the dead, whose job it is to deface Jewish headstones in the prostitute cemetery to improve the reputation of people living. I mean, it's one of these sort of absurd realistic situations. But it gets into a little bit of that background of the experience of these women and the community that came out of it. Not on purpose, of course, in Buenos Aires. It's called the Ministry of Special Cases. But you can absolutely read more about that the criminal organization that built up around it, the way it went about. And again, it's one of these shandas, one of these scandals in Jewish history. Now, were there criminals in other communities? Are there criminals among the Chinese and the Italians? And of course, other peoples have their criminals too. But we shouldn't assume that we are, unique in not having them, because we have them.
I wanted to mention that I'm reading this, The Great Dissenter, because I heard an interview with the author on WBZ. And this man, he was a judge, Supreme Court judge, and he was a slave owner. And but then changed and was the a voice for equal rights and voting and so on. And there's just so much out there. And of course, now with all the turmoil that's still here, that we're still experiencing with racism and you name it, right? It's still with us. So there's just so much to think about and do and read. So thank you. This was just great.
Good. Well, and the other message I'll share with you is one that's also made the rounds. As I said at the beginning of my talk, maybe it's easier to declare a slavery's over day than it is to actually do the hard work of dealing with the legacy of that experience. And so there's more to do. So in some ways, Juneteenth is step one. Okay. All right. We're going to acknowledge this moment, acknowledge this. What next? What now? What can we use to move this forward, and don't simply stop and say, okay, we've got a day, we're done. We've declared Martin Luther King Jr. Day, we're done. No, that's not how that works.